I'm not worried about Bitcoin at all in quantum. Genuinely worried about my HSBC bank account when it comes to quantum. But Bitcoin, I think, will have many warning signals and plenty of time. The Jeffrey Epstein association with Bitcoin, I think, also somehow managed to freak people out as well. And I think that if you don't understand Bitcoin and what it is and where it's going, then it is easy to get flushed out.
Hi, Richard. So today we have for this episode Richard Byworth. He's a Bitcoin OG, very involved with the institutional side of Bitcoin and as well as involved in many products. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Leo. Very happy to be here. Great to have met you in Barcelona in person. So looking forward to the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, so we met in Barcelona. You gave a keynote for a bank. And it was interesting because I think it was before your keynote, someone from the bank gave a presentation kind of saying how Bitcoin treasury companies are doing okay. But the new thing was, Ethereum-backed treasury companies and Solana-backed treasury companies. I saw your face a little bit at your reaction, but I wanted to kind of have you expand on that and how that is basically just a crazy thing to do. But so what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think a lot of people don't understand the incentive behind doing a particular Solana-based treasury company is that a lot of these tokens are locked up. So the FTX estate was selling locked Solana at huge discounts to the actual price. So the creation of Solana treasury companies is a monetization event for these people that have no liquidity and huge discounts to the actual value of Solana. So for them to sell their Solana into the company at essentially a one times MNAV was a very profitable trade. And I think that a lot of people didn't understand that. Obviously, they don't have the flexibility to then correct the MNAV if you have a persistent period of time where the stock trades below the NAV value of the company because they can't actually sell it because it's all locked up. So I think many of these DATs, as we call the non-Bitcoin treasury companies, have these sorts of issues with them. Um, and you know, if you look back to the original premise of why would you build a Bitcoin treasury company, you build a Bitcoin treasury company because it's the hardest asset in the world. It's the pristine collateral. And a lot of people bandy that phraseology around, not really understanding what it means. But we talked earlier about my work with Jan 3, and a big part of that work is creation of Bitcoin-backed bonds to build out energy infrastructure for some of these countries. And so, when you think about that process and that sort of innovation, that's going to then lead into the overall fixed income markets in the US, eventually having a piece of Bitcoin as a portion of the collateral for the bonds. So that's how you end up seeing Bitcoin, and it's just very liquid use case, and ultimately declining volatility, although the past few weeks and months haven't shown that to the downside. Eventually that's where we're going. We're going to a lower volatility product, which means that it can be a much more reliable base collateral. So when you build these DATs on things that are just vaporware that can be printed out of nothing, it's really a very different premise than a BTCTC, as I call them. And I do differentiate, obviously, as we always want to differentiate between Bitcoin and crypto. Bitcoin's the hard asset, crypto's venture capital on steroids. And so, sure, you can play in venture capital and steroids if that's what you want to do, but be prepared to lose all your money. And that's, the same premise of these DATs. So you wouldn't build a DAT, or you wouldn't list a venture company in its very early stages because, you don't want to have to be committed to a quarterly numbers picture that you do when you're in the public markets. And so I think that's the real difference between the two things. And as always, when it comes to crypto, people are going to find out the hard way.
100%. That's probably like the only way to really learn that. Um, So yeah, that's an interesting point. And people forget that for centuries there has been gold-backed bonds, but very little experience with silver-backed loans. And that is because they always choose the hardest asset, which is why even more argument to say that Bitcoin-backed loan, the hardest asset, it's the one that will be used and will be successful, not so
Mm.
much second, third, fourth, whatever, less. Hardest, no? And yeah, I completely agree with that. And you also mentioned the price drop, the 45% drop that we have recently seen. Um, it seems that not a lot of the ETFs were sold. Um, where is this drop coming from? Who's selling? And is this normal? Is this something that, very similar to what we've seen in the past? Or do you think there's some difference with all the cycles?
Yeah, I commented a few times on this. I find this bear market pretty hard to take seriously. I mean, there's no real narrative apart from a bit of FUD around quantum that has existed since the beginning of Bitcoin. And, we're seeing, you know, processes being put in place that can potentially fix that. I'm not worried about Bitcoin at all and quantum. Genuinely worried about my HSBC bank account when it comes to quantum. But Bitcoin, I think, will have many warning signals and plenty of time. You know, a lot of people don't really understand the way quantum works and the fact that it is operating in a sort of different dimension, and the fact that it is doing so means that the stability of these computers is really hard to maintain for long periods of time. So, if you wanted to hack a Bitcoin encrypted wallet, it would take somewhere around, I think it's a billion X of the current processing power of quantum computing. And that's not something that can be sort of quickly fixed by AI. This is something that needs physical implementation. And I think that this is the thing that people really struggle to understand. Um, so we were at least a decade away from any kind of real risk. And the people that will be able to control a quantum computer, will have to have, I mean, it will be like, I don't know if you know the CERN in Geneva, the underground Hadron Collider. Like you're going to be dealing with that level of investment, that level of scale. And, I don't think that the priority is necessarily going to be hacking a Bitcoin wallet, which might take you a considerable amount of time, even with a massively increased level of processing power. So I think that it will become a little bit like soft war. All the nation states will have to have quantum computing capability. It will almost be like a soft power projection, like nuclear missiles and this type of thing. So I'm pretty nonchalant about quantum at this point. I think there are BIPs in place to address it, and feel pretty confident that we'll be able to deal with that when the time comes. There's certainly plenty of people whose attention is focused on it. I don't think it's a bad thing that people's attention is focused on it, but to sell your Bitcoin because you're worried that Satoshi's wallet is going to get hacked in 10 years' time, and therefore a million coins might get exposed to the market, or even 4 million coins, if you include lost coins, get exposed to the market. That's like saying in 10 years' time, we might discover, what is it, like 5% or 5 to 20% of the gold that's outstanding in a huge discovery in China or Mongolia or something like that. That's not going to destroy gold as a store of value. It's going to dilute it at that particular point in time, but the market will absorb it and we move on. So yeah, I think the concerns around quantum are massively over amplified, as is always the case when you get a bear market. You get the fudsters that come in, the people that have missed Bitcoin, the Peter Schiffs of this world that should have been buying Bitcoin at $10 rather than recommending their clients to buy gold, and they're angry about it. They're frustrated they missed it. It's this sort of human psyche that if I didn't do it, then I'm an idiot, and I can't admit I'm an idiot. So everybody else is an idiot, and Bitcoin must die. And I think that is sadly the way that a lot of people think. A lot of the journalists that covered Bitcoin early, they think this way. And so we constantly get this Bitcoin is dead sort of reporting from the Financial Times and the like. And you see the arguments of these people. It's shockingly bad and embarrassing for journalistic integrity. So yeah, I think Daniel Batten has done amazing work to counter the FUD around the environmental side. We've seen that slowly dissipate. We're going to have a few people come forward and do the same sort of work that Daniel's done with quantum.
100%. And then a lot of people, I think Adam Back was saying this, like rule out the idea that such upgrades in Bitcoin may not ever need to take place. Like we're assuming this progression and innovation in quantum computers, which is reasonable, as in like we've seen it in the past, and there's this adoption and this
Mm.
increase in technology, but it may not happen. Like we're just making all
Mhm.
these hypotheses. So yeah, that's an interesting point. And then, so moving on to kind of more treasury companies like Bitcoin-backed treasury companies, and then some products that Michael Saylor's developing, like STRC. How do you see this? And then obviously, he's making a lot of headlines and how journalists are trying to mislead, saying that he's going to get liquidated and stuff. And we know that his debt is not can't get liquidated in that sense. Um, any concerns? I know you're not particularly concerned with institutions like owning a lot of Bitcoin because I think that's just part of the normal adoption, and if anything, it's a
Mhm.
good thing. And there's already enough individuals with hands on enough Bitcoin that that's not something to worry about. Is there anything that worries you in that sense from these products like STRC or institutions like Strategy owning that much Bitcoin?
No, I think what Strategy is doing is super sensible. They're being very conservative. I mean, people will probably note that the purchases that they're making every week, it's not entirely from STRC. They're actually doing quite a considerable amount of the ATM in the common, which is really important because if you think about,
Wait,
STR,
can you explain what that means? So if it's not coming on
yeah,
STRG, where like how are they buying that Bitcoin?
yeah. So basically, Strategy every week is running ATMs at the market programs to basically sell the products that they have listed. And the ones that they're getting the most liquidity from are STRC and the common equity, so MSTR. The reason that they continue to sell the common equity, even though the MNAV is, I don't know, anywhere between 1.05 and 1.2, depending on the day, it's still accretive to the shareholder, but B is more important. B, it continues to expand the collateral base that is not being expanded through the debt. So actually, you have this sort of growing of the overall Bitcoin pie, but the debt burden against that Bitcoin collateral is not necessarily running away. It would run away if he was doing billions of dollars of STRC. You'd have incremental percentage increase of the collateral base. What he's doing is quite conservative and continuing to expand the Bitcoin ownership that's not encumbered by debt, right? So if you think today, let's just throw a number out there. I don't know what the right number is. So 10% of the Bitcoin that he holds is debt. So he's got the Bitcoin, but he's also got 10% of that value is debt. To your earlier point, worrying about liquidation, and not that you can with a perpetual preferred equity, there's no risk to that. There is, of course, a risk to being able to pay continuously the coupons, but the point is that he's expanding the amount of Bitcoin that he has that's not raised through debt. And that's important because it's keeping, not completely, but to some degree, that ratio of, debt versus actual Bitcoin. And again, just to be very clear for your viewers, the perpetual equity, the perpetual preferred equity is not debt. It's a debt-like instrument, but it's not debt. It doesn't need to be paid back. So again, all these people obsessing over the amount of debt, the actual debt is purely left in the convertible bonds, which again, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I think it's about 6 billion. And so, you know, he's looking to monetize those converts through conversion, which makes a lot of sense. I think he has the flexibility to go to the convert holders and say, okay, maybe we refix the conversion price downwards so that they get called for conversion. I mean, these are all things that he can do. So I think um, he's looking at all his options, and I think that these people that are worried about his debt profile really just don't understand capital structure in a company. Um, I think, yeah, last time he spoke about it, I think the level that would essentially be break even against his Bitcoin holdings is like 8,000. And, bearing in mind the first call of the first convert, that's $1 billion of convert is, sorry, it's a put, not a call, it's put. That comes due in, I think, June 2027. So he's got still over a year before he needs to pay back that $1 billion. And, he has various options in his toolbox to force conversion in that eventually as well.
Yeah, 100%. He was, um, I saw in an interview, he essentially defended and explained that point and how they have, enough capital to cover, those obligations for the next however many years. So, um,
Yeah, he does. When he talks about it, he says something like 70 or 80 years. But then he is obviously talking about selling the Bitcoin.
right.
And he's talking about the dividend obligations in the prefs. So he's put aside, what is it, $2.5 billion to pay the next 2 years of dividends in the prefs.
Hmm.
At which point, of course, he's anticipating that you're going to get some level of rise in the price of Bitcoin. MNAV will probably increase. He can then just keep cranking the machine. So it does look like uh, he's got a very strong potential to absolutely supersize the company as we start to run into a more bullish environment.
100%. And then so you're also involved with Jan3, which is a company, or I don't know if it's more of a foundation or a company, but it's a company focused in state Bitcoin adoption. So we saw what happened with El Salvador, kind of an experiment. What so I guess my question would be, do you see in the foreseeable future such companies, countries adopting Bitcoin as legal tender, or do you think it'll just kind of, become an asset that's able to be collateralized, is able to, you can pay taxes in it and slowly start to integrate into the day-to-day economics? Or there will be other moves like El Salvador, which will say directly, here you can use Bitcoin to just pay everything and it'll become legal tender. How do you see that future coming up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. The two channels of conversation we generally are having with nation states are energy grid infrastructure expansion through Bitcoin bonds. And that obviously then leads to a conversation about all the debt that they already have. And generally, these resource rich, heavy debt burdened countries are normally struggling with the IMF in some way, shape, or form. And so, what we try to help them understand is that if they have a path to sort of energy grid infrastructure expansion, leveraging Bitcoin bonds, then they have a way to alleviate the IMF debt that they have and the burden. And one of the reasons I believe that El Salvador have not moved forward with the Bitcoin bonds is that they did need to have some level of, I'm not going to call it emergency funding, but they needed some funding from the IMF, and the IMF have been fairly categoric that they don't want them to continue pushing forward with the Bitcoin project. And so sort of that debt that they took down ended up slowing things down. Other countries that see this as are saying, okay, well, look, we've got huge debt with the IMF. How can we quickly monetize all of that? And I think the problem there is that, an investor's not going to come into that country unproven how serious they are about Bitcoin and write billions and billions of dollars of check for a Bitcoin bond. So what we're trying to do is with some smaller countries or smaller requirements from countries is show the path. So do some of these smaller Bitcoin bonds that will, use a portion of the capital raise to buy Bitcoin and a portion of a more meaningful portion of the capital raise to implement energy infrastructure expansion. And that can be anything from solar or utilization of natural resources like natural gas or the like. So our view is that once a country does this, it will open the floodgates to other countries jumping on it. And I think then we'll have a very different level of sovereign adoption. And I think that's what we ultimately want to try and help achieve at Jan 3. We think that, to your earlier point, do I worry about corporate adoption of Bitcoin versus the amount of individuals? I think that it's just inevitable that if you're looking at where this asset is going to take us in its collateral form, then everybody is going to have Bitcoin. And of course, nation states are going to want to have Bitcoin, and it's important for all of us that that nation states are mining, and you don't want all the mining to be, as Trump said, centered out of the US. You want it to be distributed globally across the planet with countries that hate each other, so that they don't collude, to control things. So it's really important for the decentralization of Bitcoin to continue, that we see nation state adoption and we see it across the board. And so that's what we're trying to do with Jan 3 and some of these conversations on the capital markets side. Yeah, did that answer your
Yeah, it
questions?
did. No, I was love that. And then, so I'm guessing you can't probably disclose any conversations that you're having with any nation states, but I do see, for example, my opinion from the outside is UAE seems like they're taking those steps in terms of doing a lot of mining. They started doing that kind of privately without making any public announcements or anything. It seems, and it's been discussed a lot of rumors about, UAE sovereign funds kind of acquiring a lot of Bitcoin. Um, so I guess a country like them are the ones that they could the fastest just deploy that kind of strategy or that Bitcoin use the quickest, I guess. Um, are there any other countries that you say these are probably the ones next to fall on this, Bitcoinization system? Do you have any, or I mean, I don't know if you can talk about that at all, but it would be interesting to
Yeah,
take it.
I mean, we will be announcing as and when we can. Obviously, as you can imagine, these countries don't, again, it comes back to this chicken and egg. They don't want to be the first. They'd like to be the second. They don't want to be the first. So we have a lot of these conversations. But I think that there are certain incentives for certain countries to attract residents, to change their economy, and this is an opportunity to do so as well. You can tie all of this stuff together with residency, with the right to buy property, and bring in an enormous amount of talent, because there are many countries that are losing talent to centers like the US, to Switzerland, where I live, where, even to the Middle East, the countries you mentioned, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, are now seeing huge inflows. from countries like the UK that are doing stupid things with taxes. So, eventually people need to make sure that they're attracting the best talent, the people that can build businesses. And so many of the countries that we talk to, this is another part of the conversation that's happening. Sorry, I remember the part of the sovereign side that you mentioned. So the other part that we try to always talk about with a country is making sure that there's a no capital gains tax on Bitcoin. So if you can do that, then you open the door to businesses accepting Bitcoin, but people actually spending Bitcoin because they're not creating a massive tax event for themselves by doing so. So what we're always trying to do is try to have that conversation in tandem with maybe a capital markets conversation as well.
Nice. So, and then going back to the price, which, I'd not talk about that much, but just as a reference. So we have seen this drop of 45%. It's kind of a hard to explain in that sense. We don't see a lot of ETF selling. We don't see any major scandal, any exchange going bankrupt or anything. Uh, in fact, every other metric is just going up, adoption, institutional
Mhm.
adoption, obviously mining hash rate, amount of wallets with more than 0.01 Bitcoin. So you see all that growing, the amount of Lightning usage, not all that. It seems that it's expanding and there's no one metric that you can point to and say this is, going down or this is downward trend. Um, so do you expect, it's obviously very hard to predict anything, but the second half of 2026 to be kind of more optimistic or more bullish?
Yeah, I think that there's been a certain amount of scrutiny over the last few days on manipulation. I think anyone who's been in Bitcoin that puts two and two together realizes that there is quite an interesting amount of manipulation happening in the market. You know, if people react to it, they don't have the conviction and they, read the headlines about quantum FUD or whatever. I can't remember the other FUD items that came up. Oh yes, the Jeffrey Epstein association with Bitcoin, I think also somehow managed to freak people out as well. And I think that if you don't understand Bitcoin and what it is and where it's going, then it is easy to get flushed out. I mean, I do a lot of education on Bitcoin. I try and help people understand it. And of course, every year I get more and more people to buy Bitcoin. And so my phone's been absolutely blowing up with this drawdown from October, and people saying, what's going on? Is this real? Should I be worried about it? And that's a useful moment to go to people and say, look, these are the materials you need to read. This is what you need to study and understand to get yourself comfort with it and see where we're going. Um, and I do very much believe that these bear markets make, the newer initiates either more educated or it just gets rid of them. It throws them out. So, ultimately we continue to expand the adoption, but, we're obviously losing people along the way because, as anyone who is a Bitcoin maximalist knows that the process towards understanding every aspect of Bitcoin is a timely one. It takes time. It takes, as I think it's Saylor who says, you got to read for 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours to understand Bitcoin and all the various elements to it. And it's absolutely right. And I'll never forget the firm I used to work in before the the group chairman used to always come to me and say, like, I'd spend hours with him explaining Bitcoin, and then he'd come to me a few months later and be like, no, 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 I just need you to give it to me in 2 to 3 bullet points. And frankly, if you can't explain it in 2 to 3 bullet points, then you don't understand it. And this way of thinking, it makes sense to certain things, but something as complex and multifaceted as Bitcoin, You just can't explain it in 2 to 3 bullet points. So if that's the way that you look at the world and the way that you want to have learning about the world, then you're never going to get it. And so you may as well just not buy it and stay away from it.
100%. As they always say, low time preference. Um,
Yeah.
so we usually end up the podcast with three questions, which are more like personal questions. Which is the first of, um, is there anyone you look up to or that you've looked up to throughout your life?
That's a really interesting question. I remember when I was working on doing some sort of personal growth workshops with a guy. He said you should envisage, you should sort of select board members of your life. And so I'd sort of back then it was, I think the year was 2000, early 2018. And so I selected sort of 7 or 8 people that I looked up to, and I took had a photo of each of them, and I had an album in my phone, my board members. And so, in certain things, I'd think, okay, what would Warren Buffett say in this particular situation, or what would Barack Obama say in this particular situation? And, over the years, and actually with the progress of learning about Bitcoin, you end up completely slaying all of those heroes, and Bitcoin, makes you go that way. And I think now, I think only one of the members of the board would remain on my board, and that was Elon Musk. Um, Everybody else has been fired from the board now. So yeah, I'd say Elon is an inspiration to everybody, of course. And yeah, I think if anyone has cracked the way that this universe works in terms of being really able to move into sort of quantum outcomes, it's Elon.
And do you think he now finally kind of gets the energy aspect of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I don't know really why he seems so reticent to say anything publicly about Bitcoin. Obviously, he had that very brief moment in 2020 when he was pro Bitcoin, and then Tesla was seeking funding from or I think it was going through a process of green sort of viability for the ESG crowd. And so he had to sort of step back from comments around that. But I think a lot of that FUD, as I said, has now been dismissed. I don't know why he hasn't come back to talk about it again.
Yeah, it was interesting because he was definitely, the pioneer, the first public company to just, buy and accept Bitcoin as a payment for the cars. And it's interesting because when he basically fell into the energy FUD, I remember they had a call with Jack Dorsey, I think Kathy Wood as well, before he bought X, Twitter. And how Jack Dorsey was just trying to convince him, saying, this energy thing is a FUD and you should accept Bitcoin as a payment, and that's and he kind of turned back to him and say, well, why don't you accept Bitcoin as a payment in Twitter? And he kind of just was like, well, it's different. And he didn't really answer that. But I thought that was a really fair point. Like, you're trying to sell me this thing as like this great thing. Like, why don't
Mm.
you do it if this is so
Yeah.
great? And obviously, well, I don't know the reasons behind it, but that's a fair point. I think eventually, yeah, he will b go back to that.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it might come back. I've been thinking about this as well. It might come back to the issue that you end up attracting from the IRS, right? Because Bitcoin is, on disposable, taxable in the US. So, if you're managing a platform where suddenly you're accepting payments and everybody's potentially taxable, and the IRS come at you and say, well, you need to be reporting everyone, then
yeah,
that's probably not something you want to be doing, I would
100%.
imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the next question would be, wh why do you wake up in the morning? Like, what is something that you wake up towards, you like kind of your purpose?
I really enjoy my life. I'm very lucky. I live a really great life. I enjoy every aspect of it. I mean, I get to speak to really interesting people. I don't have to speak to people that aren't interesting. every meeting I have is selected and curated. So I love every aspect of my work. Recently, I've been jumping out of bed to go and give Claude some more inputs and things that it could be working on over my day, as I'm trying to build various different things. So yeah, lots of things. I live near a lake here in Switzerland, and I get out of bed very many mornings and go for a walk down the hill to have a swim in the cold lake. But yeah, so many things. Like,
Awesome. And then my last question would be, you've mentioned that now a lot of people are reaching out to you, especially with a drop. It's always the message like, is it a good time to buy? Or like, oh, you
mm,
told me to buy, and then like, look what's happening, what's happening. Same thing when we're all-time highs, no? We always get that message like, yeah, is it a good time to buy? So you mentioned that you just relay some interesting books, articles, and stuff to read and to get more knowledgeable about why things are happening. Can you name one book or something that you would recommend viewers to just in these times say you should, double down on this if you have an investment or you want to invest in this? What things should they be reading?
I would say the best book in Bitcoin is Principles of Bitcoin by Vijay Selvan. I don't know if you've read that book. For me, it was as impactful as the Bitcoin Standard when that first came out. I think it's just such a beautifully complete book, sort of attacking Bitcoin from a first principles angle. And I think everybody should read that book. I mean, it does at times get into technical areas that maybe will be a bit much for a beginner, but I would certainly say that anyone that wants to invest the time, wants to really understand every single aspect of Bitcoin, that is a really phenomenal work by VJ.
Awesome. Well, Rich, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure the viewers would really enjoy this conversation.
Leo, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.